The African heritage and ethnohistory of the Moors, background to the emergence of early Berber and Arab people from prehistory to Islamic dynasties. Dana Rollins. Introduction. Most of us are not aware that the peoples whom the classical Greek and Roman historians call Berber were black, quote unquote, and affiliated with then the contemporary peoples of the East African area. The word Berber, in fact, was used to refer to peoples of the Red Sea area in Africa, as well as North Africans. Similarly, there was an ancient belief that the nomads dwelling in the same latitude in the deserts of Arabia were peoples whose ancestors had in same latitudes in the deserts of Arabia were peoples whose ancestors in times far distant roamed the deserts of East Africa. It was such populations in large measure comprised the Moorish people, but because of the attribute of blackness which sharply distinguished them from the bulk of the European people, the word came to be generally used by Europeans to describe persons of black complexion in general. The inhabitants of present day northern Africa are considered ethnically and culturally distinct from the people dwelling south of the Sahara. If this is so, it has only come about in relatively recent times. The several hundred years that the Moors dominated the Iberian Peninsula was an era during which many people, mostly of European descent, either migrated or were brought to the lands of Arabia and North Africa. Although large numbers of blacks were brought from the Sudan during that era, studies of the slave traffic of that time show that the numbers of people of Slavic and European descent placed into servitude far exceeded the number of Sudanese or other blacks brought and sold by the Moors. The slave trade did not acquire a color until the Portuguese. This part played by the European captives or Slav or slave in the making of the modern North Africans and Middle or Near Easterners has been ignored by historians to such an extent that most people are not even aware that such an era ever existed. This is partly the fault of the successors of the Orientalist school. The early Orientalist, quote unquote, explorers, mainly living and writing in the 18th and 19th centuries and the early part of the 20th, were basically European adventurers. They were usually of the upper classes, trained in the Arabic language, and familiar with such things as the ancient writings of the classical Roman and Greek historians, the old Hebraic texts, and some of the traditions of Islam. Many of them wanted to believe and tried to prove that the ancient Arab word and the Orient, especially Egypt, was a primitive form of European civilization and that North African Berbers and the Arabs of Arabia were, quote unquote, noble savages. That sounds like an oxymoron. No, whose European strain had been reduced by intermingling with the ignoble enslaved Negroes, the ignoble enslaved Negroes. So that's a story they came up with.
Yeah.
Most of them were anthropologists and ethnohistorians. Some of the later European writers have been a bit more objective in their historical depictions of the ancient world and the world of Islam. According to James Weller, author of The Lost Worlds of Africa, Muslim Africans brought millions of European slaves over the centuries into the North African ports of Sal, Tangier, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, Fez, Marrakesh, and the northern Egyptian towns. Literally millions were documented as being freed in North Africa by various Christian organizations in Europe. Philip Curtin points out in Ajayi and Crowder's history of West Africa that the majority of slaves being traded throughout the Mediterranean included North Africa and the Levant, modern Lebanon, Palestine/Israel, West Syria. Centuries before the fall of Constantinople, when the Black Sea trade was cut off, were of European descent. It is also known that indigenous Bedouin used to come into slave markets of the coastal cities of North Africa and Arabia by way of the desert to secure concubines, who were often of European descent. In 1150, the religious order, the Trinitarians, was founded in France to free Christian Europeans by purchase, and according to J. A. Rogers, for the next 3 centuries or more, collections were taken up in the churches for that purpose. So all our people that calling themselves Trinidadian,
Right.
that's a Christian religious order, just like the people that think they're Dominican.
Right.
Saint Dominicus,
Dominicus.
Christian order. Filipino, Christian order, King Philip.
Dang. Yep.
So in Nature Knows No Color Lines, Rogers also cites notes of Sir Walter Scott on Spanish Chronicles, which say that European Christians in Spain were forced to pay tribute to the Moors in the form of women. According to another historian, a veritable terror reigned in the Mediterranean. They ravaged the coast of Spain, Portugal, and southern France, capturing many. There is apparently documentation of the periodic landing of corsairs along the coastal areas of Europe to take off the entire population of villages. Even in 1721, King George I spoke of the great number of his subjects that have been delivered into slavery in North Africa. One rather famous Moorish sultan, Mulai Ismail of Meknes in Morocco, a few centuries ago, had as many as 25,000 European slaves who participated in the building of his colossal stables. That's real interesting right there.
Yeah.
Many of the same Europeans brought by the shipload to Africa were then sent to America, where they remained in indentured servitude. That's consistent with how them Europeans in the Eastern Seaboard,
right,
those 13 colonies or whatnot.
Right.
These are the people that was populating.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? These slaves, these Europeans.
Yeah.
And they doctored up this,
right,
cockamamie story. This was us. This was us picking the
cotton. Look like.
Okay. So many of the same Europeans brought by the shipload to Africa were then sent to America, where they remained in indentured servitude. Scottish mariners, who were often the object of the North African pirates, accidentally referred to these corsairs as niggers. Wow. Grafton Elliott Smith, who lived and wrote in the 19th century and early part of the 20th, remarked that Moor is often used in Morocco to suggest Negro influence. According to at least a dozen different Greek and Byzantine or Neo-Roman writers from the 1st to the 6th century AD, the indigenous Berber populations, whom they call Mori or Moors, were a black-skinned, warlike, nomadic, and predatory population stretching from the borders of Egypt to Morocco. They often lived on the borders of the desert and at the foots of mountains and were said to be accustomed to the usage of horses and camels in battle. At the time of their Islamization, they were bedecked in gold and long robes, armed with javelins, iron implements, swords, and shields. But these are traits which were in fact possessed by many of the nomads of the deserts east and west of the Nile. And it is such people who were also known as Berbers. In one of the Marital's writings, Satire 6, around the same era, we read the phrase, quote, woolly hair like a Moor. Silius Italus, an early writer around the beginning of the Christian era, describes the Moors as nigra or black. Corippus, a 6th century historian, in his Jonadid comedy speaks of the quote fasces nigroi colors and of their blackness as horrida or horrifying. Procopius, another 6th century Byzantine historian, says the Moors, Morsorasi, or Morosio, what's that say? Morosio? Morosoi?
Yeah, it could be any shit you say right now.
Yeah, were people composed of a number of black-skinned tribes who had gained domination over all of North Africa after the period of the Vandals' ascendancy in Africa. In that pre-Islamic era, the Moorish peoples, who were later to invade Spain, were in fact noted for their skin color. They were described with such descriptive phrases as black as melted pitch and blacker than ink in certain well-known European epics and histories. The word Moor had in fact come to be used during the Middle Ages for a man of a very dark or black hue, for which reason several authors and playwrights of that period, including Shakespeare and Voltaire, used the term for individuals they otherwise designate as Negro. The phrase black as a Moor was used from Roman times until the Middle Ages. In one manuscript of the 14th century, quoted by J.A. Rogers, we read, quote, though men of Nubia be Christian, they be as the Moors for the great heat of the sun. The same 14th century observer also refers to the Ethiopians as Moors. The black and woolly hair Christ, sometimes seen in the Iberian Peninsula, according to the famous traveler James Michener, were referred to as Moors rather than as Negroes, which is derived from the Latin nigger or nigra. In modern times, it has often been suggested that when the earlier Europeans said black or Ethiopians in reference to North Africans, they did not actually mean black, but a dark or swarthy man, like certain modern day North African Berbers, and many people living in Arab countries. So they're telling you right here, black in a literal sense.
Right.
That's not clearly not talking about that. Right. They're dark and swarthy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Wow. All right. So this interpretation does not explain the hundreds of jet black men with woolly hair who appear later in European coat of arms and heraldry under the dozens of variations of the term Moor in almost every European country. Some of the names under these variants that J.A. Rogers uncovered include such names as Moorhead, Blackmore, Morrison, Maury, Maurice, Moore, Moore, Morocco, Morites, Morin, Maurice, Morini, Moreu, Morilli, Mormon, Mormon, Morinkup, and Swarthmore, to name but a few. The Germans even today eat Mohrenkopf candies, which are dark chocolates shaped vaguely in the form of heads. Wow. The word Mohrenkopf means a moorhead. Mohrenkopf. Mohrenkopf. Okay. Mohrenkopf in German is moorhead. All of this is evidence that before the 15th century, in the Atlantic slave trade, the word Moor meant more than just a Muslim or Mauritanian or Moroccan. and was associated more specifically with people of brownish black or absolute black color. During the Middle Ages, masqueraders used to blacken their faces so they might better pass as Moors, and they would dance such dances as the Moorish dance of England and the Morisca dance is apparently named after the and derived after from Moors. Hmm. Another of these legacies in dance is known as flamenco moro, a dance from which today's flamenco is derived. Hmm. The renown of the Moors in the arts was such that a Frenchman wrote in the 1600s, quote, I can tell from here what the inhabitants of Venus are like. They resemble the Moors of Granada, a small black people burned by the sun, full of wit and fire, always in love, writing verse, fond of music, arranging festivals, dances, and tournaments every day. That's heavy. The Moors are thought to have introduced the earliest versions of several instruments, including the lute or the el out, wow, the guitar or kichara, and the lyre. The arts and letters flourished among the Moors in Spain, and they were renowned for their skills and contributions to the sciences and philosophy as well. Rogers mentions certain books, one published in 1610, in which the Spaniards are described as a quote unquote white people being ruled by quote unquote black people or black one. The word Moor signified a black man, and the word and the people who were called Moors were the North African ancestors of the dark brown and brown black peoples of the present day Sahara and Sahel, mainly those called Fulani or Tuareg or Zanaga of southern Morocco, Kutna and Sabu of the Sahel countries, as well as Moorish and other black, quote unquote, black Arabs who lived in Mauritania and throughout the Sahel. They included the Taraza of Mauritania and Senegal, the Maghraba, as well as dozens of other Sudanese Arab tribes, as well as the Chamba of Algeria. The long, lanky, dark brown men called Tariq, Tariq, or Tuareg, Tuareg, who can still be seen veiled and armed with sword and shield, striding through the desert with their camel, are still involved in the desert commerce they were in charge of during the Middle Ages. Huh. The copper black Arab Moors are descendants of the Yemenites and Hijazi Arabians, the main bringers of Islam to Africa. They still trace their ancestry to the Yemen or southern Arabia, and like their kinsmen in Yemen, they can be seen playing Moorish melodies with string percussion and wind instruments under shade trees in Mauritania. The turban Tibu and Zakawa, jet black and wiry men, once known for their sorcery and their skill in metallurg- metallurgy, metallurgy, are still spread across the hottest areas of the Sahel and southern parts of the Sahara. The red or pastoral Fulani, renowned for their holy wars, which converted so many Sudanese tribes to Islam, performed, can still be seen performing acrobatic dances. The steps and towns, the steps and turns of which mirror the breakdancing. Wow. So breakdancing, because that's something ancient we've been
Yeah,
doing.
right. It ain't nothing new.
Wow. Reviving by Afro Cubans in America in the early years of this century. The haunting music of some of the desert dwellers, like the Tarek and the so called Moorish Arabs, are strongly reminiscent of the traditional harmonies heard in the music of Spain and Portugal, and has left a characteristically beautiful, equally haunting quality in the traditional folk music of Mali and Islamic Africa in general. Listening carefully, one can discern in their melodies the early blues tonalities of blacks of the American South, and still found in the rhythms of the melodies of the modern blues. The Moors founded and constructed many industrious and prosperous towns and cities in the Iberian Peninsula and all over the northern Africa and as far south as Timbuktu and other areas of the Sudan, to which many students from other parts of Europe came to study and through which many of the arts and sciences of Africa and Asia were transplanted into European soil. The remnants of their many castles can be seen in northern Africa, as in Spain and Portugal. This being said, one does not have to wonder why there has been very little focus in European history on the legacy of the Moors or their influence on Europeans' emergence from the Dark Ages. This is unfortunate, for these men and women belong to a black population, quote unquote, whose dominance extended from the borders of Egypt to Morocco and the Atlantic, even before the time of the Muslim invasion of North Africa. There are a people whose documented history goes back in North Africa to the time of the pharaohs and the phase of the Carthaginian history that produced Hannibal. Most books that attempt to speak of Berber origin, though the Moors were not just the Berbers, claim that they were whites, quote unquote, affiliated biologically with Europeans, like those who live in the Atlas Mountains and close to the Mediterranean today. The prestige and growing power of Western Europe did much to change the perception of North Africa's original ethnic relationship to groups in the sub Saharan areas. In the 15th century, with the coming of Portuguese and Spanish slave traders, the earliest of the European slavers, along with the Turks, the slave trade was gradually transformed so that Africans became the vast majority of slaves in Mediterranean Europe, North Africa, and the so called Orient, including the Arabian Peninsula. After the fall of Constantinople, the Black Sea slave trade was cut off. Turkish rulers in North Africa were inclined to depend on middlemen of the Sahara to bring slaves from the Sudan, rather than to look to Europe, where growing technical and military strength coupled with nationalism made slave importation from northern provinces a far more difficult proposition. In early periods, the Berbers had been subject to the rulers of the Sudanese kingdoms, but as the era of the Ottoman Turks and the Atlantic slave trade was ushered in, both Berber and Arab tribes of the Sahara began battling for control over the established trade routes leading to the Sudan. These routes were being fiercely contested because of the increasing demand and the payments given for slaves in the trading towns. East Africa, where both whites and blacks had been sold up until a late period. Europeans established themselves as overseers of the trade and helped to make sure the steady stream of African slaves were available for the traders of Yemen and Oman or Osman, and other parts of the Arab world. That might be just Alman. Slavery was aggravated by the rather distorted demands of capitalism. Rulers in Sudan were often ready and willing to comply because of the money involved. Apart from this, they conceived of themselves as possessing ethnicities different from the people they sold. The 18th century saw not only the economic ascendancy of Europe, but a great devaluation of African humanity south of the Sahara. And according to a recent writer, while the Turks, Arabs, and Berbers would marry their daughters off to European slaves, wow, marriage to a man of the Sudan, slave or free, was considered de- denigrating. Denigrating. On the other hand, many of the sultans in North Africa and the Middle East had mothers who were Sudanese. In Europe too. So wait. So let's see what's going on here. So that was basically conspiring with the Europeans or some of our people for the purpose of basically they turning the Moors into basically this Negro thing, or you know what I mean? So they composed a plan. So that's kind of like this, you know, our people were selling out, so there was an agenda going on. Okay. Wow. So in the 18th century, saw not only the economic ascendancy of Europe, but a great devaluation of African humanity south of the Sahara. And according to a recent writer, while the Turks, Arabs, and Berbers would marry their daughters off to European slaves, marriage to a man of Sudan, slave or free, was considered denigrating. On the other hand, many of the sultans of North Africa and the Middle East had mothers who were Sudanese. In Europe, too, African men were beginning to be glamorized as exotic favorites of noble women, and African women as mistresses of noble men and artists. But in general, the peoples from sub-Saharan Africa came to be perceived as not worthy of such respect as human beings. So that's the distinction where they start separating and classifying sub-Saharan African. But these are still Moors.
Right.
But it's just a plot
Right.
to denationalize, you know what I mean?
Right.
So our people was down with it, and it was down with it. They collaborated.
Right.
But in actuality, I think yeah. You starting to see like the specifics.
Yeah. Right.
Because when you look up, they'll say that this term sub-Saharan African is a generic term like black.
Right. That's what
you know, African American.
My DNA test, they'll try to say sub-Saharan and shit like
Yeah.
that.
A general term.
Right.
You know what I mean? But wow, it's interesting. So, but in general, the people from sub-Saharan Africa came to be perceived as not worthy of much respect as human beings. The northern element in North Africa, which by the 18th century was already more European than African or Arab, came to look condescendingly. Okay, so they basically looked down on Africa as a place of uncultured people, from whence comes the perennial slave or the abd. It is a perception which has not entirely disappeared among the westernized people of the North African area and the Middle East. These negative perceptions have recently been intensified because of the way Black Africans, quote unquote, or people of African descent are portrayed in the Western media and in the scholarly publications. Wow, they dropping it.
Yeah.
This is why that book $1,000 damn near. This would debunk that slave trade stuff, you know what I mean? And put it, people start connecting the dots. It was after the late era of the slave trade that there came to be a penchant for using words other than Moor for the Africans who were then being taken into Europe in status. Servile status. For Moor had previously denoted one of the more admired and markedly empowered people of Europe. In fact, General Franco of Spain used troops very black in color who were called Moorish. So wow, they was intentionally not using Moor no more on purpose.
Right.
And you see that it says servile status. So they put them in a different status. You know what I mean? And they stopped putting out literature, you know what I'm saying? Start putting out a narrative of a certain way history went down. You know what I mean? Separated the moms from the children, and now they have no, you know, they're speaking languages that's not their primary one. Um, so this necessitated ignoring the ethnic heritage and history of the men called Moors, who were in fact people called in ancient times Berbers and Arabians. One is led to believe from ancient writings on Berbers that they were hordes of tanned European-looking men with no affiliation to the black-skinned, lightly built Africans that the ancients said they were. Instead, we are told they were Africans of the white race, which semi-white men of the Orient had converted to Islam and led into Portugal and Spain. The Arabs of that era were also mostly Bedouin, who brought that language and beliefs of their ancient desert culture and some of the complex cultural traditions of ancient Arabia and parts of Asia into North Africa. Berbers were the Aboriginal indigenes of North Africa, mostly desert and mountain dwellers, who belonged to a type that predominated in the same latitudes as those of the Arabian Peninsula, as well as further north and east in Asia centuries before Islam. Ancient Arabia was occupied by a people far different in appearance than most of this modern day occupants. So ancient Arabia was occupied by a people far different in appearance than most of its modern day occupants. These were a people who once occupied Egypt, who were affiliated with the East African stocks, who now speak the Hamitic or Semitic languages. These were the people who, in the days of the Romans, were the majority of the occupants of the Arabian Peninsula. Waves of colonizations by Romans, Greeks, Turks, Iranians, Iraqis, and others combined with the Europeans to bring about the gradual modifying of the physical appearance and culture of the people in the areas of North Africa, closest to the Mediterranean, as well as the people who populated the Iberian Peninsula. The West has played down, ignored, or completely denied the role of colonization, slavery, and concubinage in the creation of the population and coastal cities of North Africa like Cairo, Tunis, and Algiers. This population is phenotypically similar in many respects to those areas in the opposite side of the Mediterranean and the southern portions of Europe. European academia has usually preferred to see this demographic phenomenon as testimony to the Caucasoid or European origin of such peoples, as the ancient Berbers, Moors, and Egyptians. It is because the original populations have since been overwhelmed by others biologically and culturally that few Westerners have written of the ethnic heritage or contributions of ancient cultures of North Africa, whether in Egypt or Tunisia or Morocco, in the context or terms of their real or black African background. They have chosen to concentrate on the most recent world of the Arab and Berber speaking peoples and present it as if it is a world that has always been. It is like comparing the Aztecs of 500 years ago with the ethnic mix of America today. The story of when North Africa was Moorish and Arabia, the land of Saracens, has yet to be told. The following essay will try to present the evidence which demonstrates the biological and the ethnic ties of the ancient Moors with other indigenous quote unquote blacks of Africa. The Arab, as known to the Greek and Romans. In the days of Muhammad and the Roman colonizations of Palestine, North Arabia, and Africa, the term Arab was much more than a nationality. It specifically referred to peoples whose appearance, customs, and language were the same as the nomadic people on the African side of the Red Sea. In fact, the term included the populations of the Red Sea in Africa. Some now think that the word Arab is a word literally meaning nomad, although the word has never been used to refer exclusively to nomads. According to ancient Southern Arabian inscriptions, the word Arab or Aribi was a name of one of the Himyarite tribes of Yemen in the Babel Mandeb area. Before the spread of Islam, there lived in the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, northern Syria, Iraq, and Hadramaut nomads who were nearly as black as the Moors. They later conquered and converted to Islam. Because of the word Mori had come to signify a man of black or nearly black complexion. The Arabian who invaded northern Africa came also to be referred to as Moorish. The lesser modified occupants of Arabia were and are described in Arabic as Hadara or black. This word originally signified that which is like the color of a type of iron, which was greenish black, like with that green, maybe with green. Thus, such beginnings that are black are very dark like iron, or like the night, are often described in early era writings as Hadara, which literally means green, but signifies something black. The peoples of Chad, until the Europeans colonized the area, sang of Tunis, the, the Hadara, in memory of the presence of the dark complexioned Arabs who once ruled there. Interesting. So Hadara, so referring to somebody dark colored, but have like a green little hue. Or
Right.
according to Ammianus Marcellianus, Roman general of the 4th century AD, the Bedouin populations of southern Syria and the Arabian Peninsula, whom the Romans called Saracens, derived the Sahara or Sahara, meaning desert nomads, were peoples who, quote, whose primary origin was derived from the cataracts of the Nile on the borders of the Blimies. The Blimies or Baja are a people located then and now in the deserts east of the Nile in Sudan. They rode on camels and, like the Moors, were particularly notorious for their hit and run raids from the desert fringes. They were lightly clad, dressed in tunics, only to the waist, and were experts at pillaging, for which reason Ammianus claimed they were, quote, not good to have as friend or foe. A stratum of peoples of relatively recent African origin extended into Asia. The evidence of linguistic archaeology, physical remains, and ethnohistory support the observance and descriptions we find in the histories of the Greeks and Romans, and in later Iranian documents about the nomadic Iranians of that early area. The Arabs were the direct progeny and kingsmen of the dark brown, Grasso, and kinky haired Ethiopic peoples that first spread over the desert areas of Nubia and Egypt. Before the middle of the second millennium, they were located along the Mediterranean coast in Turkey, Europe, and the Arabian Peninsula. In their least modified form, they may be found now settled in the Horn of Africa, the Southern Sahara, and remote parts of Europe. These people spoke languages belonging to a group that linguists now call Eritrean. Wow. Is that what I'm saying? Eritrean? Eritrean? Or Afro-Asian, Afro-Asiatic, formerly called Hamito-Semitic. The dialects are spoken predominantly in the Horn of Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East. They include the dialects called Cushitic, Amharic,
Yeah.
Ethiopic, or Ethio-Semitic. The later grouping is descended from ancient dialects of Arabia, which in turn have their roots in Africa. In North Africa, the dialects include the Berber and Arabic, which is a latecomer to Africa and the last evolved of the African Asiatic dialects. They also include the ancient Semitic dialects of Syria and Mesopotamia, as well as the language of ancient Egypt, which some scholars consider to be Proto-Semitic. The early Semitic dialects include those called Akkadian, Amorite, Aramean, Canaanite, Hebrew, and South Arabic. The language of the original Semitic speakers, however, was also adopted by other North Syrian peoples indigenous to Asia. These later seem to have been predominantly fair-skinned, broad-nosed, prominent-nosed people who came to predominate in northern Syria, northern Armenia, and Mesopotamia, especially those populations of the areas anciently called Assyria and Ibla. They were in custom and origin much different from the people of the desert who could claim an African origin when the Romans fought them in Syria and Arabia centuries after Christ. Some of the most prominent linguists today have suggested that the Semitic languages and culture originated in Ethiopia and spread from there to South Asia, to Southwest Asia. It was long ago pointed out that Egyptian seemed to be a Proto-Semitic dialect, and that Cushitic languages of the area of Sudan and Ethiopia possess the seeds of the Semitic dialects. And although modern Ethio-Semitic dialects seem to be descended from those of the Abyssinian, Sabian, and Himyaritic immigrants, who colonized parts of Ethiopia and Somalia about 500 BC. Recent studies show that Semitic languages have been spoken in Ethiopia for at least 400 years, 4,000 years. Rock art and the stone or lithic industry of the Rabal Khali or empty quarter, Central Desert in South Arabia seem to point also to Somalia and the Horn of Africa as the area from which a wave of sheep herding people immigrated to Arabia during the period 5000 and 4000 BC. The people portrayed in this art have been described by Emmanuel Anati, an archaeological specialist who has written on the drawing as Negroid, which the extent of this rock art, however, stretched to the Persian Gulf area in the east and has some affiliation with certain early cultures of Mesopotamia. The art, the art also shows some elements of similarity with the rock art of the Chalcolithic period in the South Syrian desert and the Jersean painting in southern Egypt. One early specialist in Egyptian rock art and glyphs suggested Egypt, but they were essentially the same as the art of people dwelling in the hills and deserts east of the Nile. Similar depictions of dark-skinned men and other elements reminiscent of the early pre-dynastic Egyptian culture appear in the Jebel Kara area, where several of the tribes still resemble the people of the Nubian desert called Baja, as well as other Cushitic and Ethiopic speaking people in Ethiopia, Sudan, and Eritrea. The Shahara or Shahiri, whose name was made famous through the story of Scheherazade, still live in Jebel Kara and the hills of Dithufar of Oman. These Afro-Semitic people, according to Sir Richard Burton and famous Orientalist explorer, are a people with low brow and black skins, with frail and slender frames. According to Bertrand Thomas, these people, who speak some of the oldest living Arab dialects, resemble the Cushites called Bija, now living in the deserts east of the Nile in Sudan and Ethiopia. Such people appear in isolation further to the north of the peninsula as well as in Iran, where they apparently call themselves Lamb. The men in the Arabian rock art wore small beards like those in Sahara rock art. They also wore headdresses and used throwing sticks. The ostrich, the shield, the staff, and the phallus are often portrayed. These were apparently sacred symbols, which often have totemic significance today among pastoral people in Africa, especially in the Sahel and Cushitic areas. They carried on ceremonies associated with the ox and the phallus. They practiced mock battle similar to that of the Cushitic and the Nilo-Saharan people of East Africa. The men portrayed in the art of the Arabian desert, in fact, bear great resemblance to the slender and lightly bearded nomads which appeared in the same epoch in the Sahara. G. Elliott Smith, who early recognized the ancient prevalence of the Eritrean or Abyssinian type of man in the Near and Middle East, which he named The brown race was a specialist in the physical anthropology and had studied the osteological remains of the Middle East and Africa. Smith asserted that there was good reason to believe that the early inhabitants of Arabia and southern Syria were essentially the same. Osteologically speaking, as the A group population of Nubia, he was also adamant about his belief that the modern Cushitic speakers of Ethiopia and the modern inhabitants of ancient Egypt were genetically related, though still inhabiting the southern desert and some of the mountainous areas of Ammon. These slender, dark brown pastoral tribes are not very numerous in Arabia today. It is this small African type that Kramer, the founder of Sumerian studies, talked about when he spoke of the brown man that occupied Sumer. In Jebel Dajan, in modern day Saudi Arabia, people indistinguishable from modern Eritreans live. The houses they build are also similar to those found in Eritrea. Huh. In modern day Yemen live the Murad mentioned as Himyarite, Himyarite tribe in early inscriptions. Several other tribes of this ancient Afro-Semitic stock still dwelt in the desert and coastal areas of the peninsula. Their customs, in many cases, are like those of the Abyssinians. Such types in Arabia are represented in tribes like the Harb, who dwell north of Mecca. Not long ago, Sir Richard Francis Burton, in his travels to Arabia, met men from the Harb tribe who were the ruling clan of the Hijaz. That's a cool picture right there. Girls of Yemen and Arabia, the ancient home of Sheba or Saba and the Himyarites. He describes them in the personal narrative of his pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina as having attenuated limbs, a chocolate brown color, and bushy hair, with screaming voices. He called them the ruling clan of the Hijaz area, which is the area of Mecca, the early Muslim town. The Harb, who dwelt in the northern Hijaz when visited by the explorer Burton, are by tradition the descendants of the Gahassan or Assanite Saracens, described by Roman writers like Arminius, wait, Ammianus Marcellinus. The Hamida, the largest clan of the Harb, are mentioned in ancient South Arabic inscriptions. Hamida are also found in modern Sudan. The Beni Harb, according to the Arab genealogy, were also related to those Arabs that invaded North Africa in the 11th century, called Qais, Aliam, Elam, Sulaim, and Halal. Thus, it was that a few centuries after Arminius Marcellius wrote, men of this sort, proclaiming themselves followers of Muhammad, left the Arabian Peninsula, the area of the Hijaz and Yemen, lands which they had inhabited for some 4,000 years. They invaded the countries of the north and northeast of them, turning the speech of those lands to the speech that is called Arab. and the culture of those lands in part to the Afro Semitic culture. Ever since then, most Muslims who speak the language of the Hadhara Mohammedans have been referred to as Arab. In the 1500s, Jews called Anazia lived in the hills of the Kabar, ancient capital of Judaism in Arabia. They are now found in both North and South Arabia and were described by an Italian explorer as black, though some are blacker than others, with voices like women. They flayed alive any Muslim who came within their midst. They are by tradition descendants of those who fled Judea at the time of Bukha al-Nasur or Nebuchadnezzar, the Chaldeo-Babylonian king who invaded their land. Hmm. The early desert populations of Arabia and Africa were for the most part derived from Africans who seem to have undergone a specialized physical development, having evolved in hot, dry regions in the late Stone Age. Many of the Eritrean looking men of Arabia and those in Africa appropriately, inappropriately named Hamites by European academia are often found in areas where temperatures soar above 120 degrees. They tend to be very slender with glacial bones and attenuated limbs. The skin, though dark brown or black brown, tends to have a strong reddish hue, which is thought also to be due to the ecological pressures of the environment in which they evolved. Hmm. Long and narrow pentagonoid shaped faces are common. Narrow noses and little or no prognathism are typical and associated with the modified aspect of their facial and cranial morphology. That's interesting right there. These characteristics, once presumed to be a legacy of non-Negroid or Caucasoid intermixture, are now attributed by some population biologists and geneticists to the ancient adaptation of Africoids to certain specific ecological factors, including the change to a Neolithic diet in combination with dwelling in exceedingly hot, dry habitats. Thus, the indigenous or black tribes of Arabia were those in ancient times immigrated from Africa during the Neolithic era, approximately 4 to 5,000 BC, and were the earliest purveyors and dispersers of the Semitic dialects, especially of the early Semitic, which prevailed in the area of Syria and Mesopotamia as well. This is to say, the Syrians that Ammianus Marcellinus saw were dwelling in Arabia for at least 3 to 4,000 years before he encountered them. They were not only familiar with the desert, but have been involved in the creation of some of the earliest so-called Semitic civilizations. Some, like the Thamudini, the Thamudini, or Tamali, are mentioned as desert dwellers. in Assyrian texts of the 7th century BC. They are mentioned along with the tribe called Sabai, who were in fact the Sabian of southern Arabia, and Makkah, who were perhaps the Makkah Saracens of Mesopotamia mentioned by the Romans a century later. Their cattle and camels were without number. The Gargini, or Hagar, whom Ammianus, Saint Jerome, and others spoke of, were probably the same tribe mentioned thousands of years earlier in the inscriptions of the Persian Gulf area on an island called Dilmun. There were those of the Saracens who had immigrated north from the southern parts of Arabia after some ecological catastrophe had caused the breaking of the dam in the Sabian civilizations. Such people were the Asanites or the Hadara, Gahassanides, and Layanites of the early texts. Others, like the Nabataeans or Petra, were in fact known as the Amorites until a late period. By Arabic historical tradition, they were descendants of Nimrod and Cush, who were said to have come to Jordan after having left the Chattel Arab area of present-day Iraq, or what was then known as Babylon. It must be said here that the early Greeks and Romans did not usually distinguish ethnical between the people called Saracens and the inhabitants of Arabia, of Yemen, which was called India Minor or Little India in those days, nor Southern Arabians from the inhabitants of the Horn of Africa. So they're saying they couldn't distinguish, the Romans and Greece couldn't distinguish somebody from quote unquote India or Hindustan from somebody from the Horn of Africa. What differences there were between them were more cultural and environmental than anything else. Strabo, around the 1st century BC, Philostratus, and other writers speak of the area east of the Nile in Africa as Arabia. And the people are persistently and indiscriminately and sometimes simultaneously referred to as either Arabs, Indians, or Ethiopians, just as Native Americans in Central and North America are characteristically grouped under a single term as Indians. Wow, I just made the connection. Strabo even went so far as to say that the peoples called as as troglodytes, the indigenous of the ancient Horn should be called Ethiopians, should not be called Ethiopians, as they were really Arabs. That's heavy right there. Strabo even went so far as to say that the peoples called as Indians. I keep jumping that. And the people are troglodytes. I want to run this whole little thing. So what differences there were between them were more cultural and environmental than anything else. Strabo around the 1st century BC, Philostratus, and other writers speak of the area east of the Nile in Africa as Arabia, and the people are persistently and indiscriminately and sometimes simultaneously referred to as either Arabs, Indians, or Ethiopians, just as the Native Americans in Central and North America are characteristically grouped under a single term as Indians. Strabo even went so far as to say that the peoples called troglodytes, the indigenes of the ancient Horn, should not be called Ethiopians, as they were really Arabs. Although the ancients were aware of the movement of people like the Habeshan or Bishmat, the Sabians from the Arabian Peninsula to the Horn a few centuries before the Christian era, a movement fairly well documented by archaeologists. It is clear from the ancient writings on the Arabs that the peoples of the Arabian Peninsula and the non-immigrant indigenous nomads of the Horn were considered ethnically one and the same, and thought to have originated in areas near the cataracts of the Nile. Troglodytes, Bija, were said to have lived on both sides of the Red Sea. Several southern Arab peoples, like the Hamarite of Yemen, who are sometimes referred to as Ethiopians, and the Madinai or Mahdi of the Hijaz, Asir, were considered Saracen by Procopius. Such people had strong commercial ties with Africa through the Red Sea trade. It is hard to imagine that the people on the Arabian coast on the eastern side of the Red Sea, called in ancient inscriptions Mahdi or Mahdi, were not in the sun were not in some way related to those men called in ancient times Magi, Magi, or Magi. Basically Magi,
Yeah.
but it's just spelled crazy. Um, or different than I'm used to saying Magi. But that's what, yeah, no matter how you spell it, you're forced to pronounce it Magi.
Right.
Basically, pretty much. The Egyptologist rendering of the name on the western or African side of the Red Sea. The Magi, as mentioned before, 2000 BC, and appear as late as Roman times in Egyptian texts as fruitulent desert nomads. They are presently considered to be ancestral to modern Bajau or Cushites. The later Magi carried on a great caravan trade with Egypt as late as the days of the Romans, and the former Magi were considered incense traders. According to Joseph Cleodemus and later writers, a maiden gave birth to the founders of tribes called Afran or Afra and Abida and Hebila, Ludadas and Rama, whose descendants crossed over into Libya. In fact, these could be none other than the Abida, Afrin, sons of Midian, of Genesis fame. Joseph makes Madden the brother of Midian, father of the two tribes. According to later traditions, Afra, also known as Ifricus or Farik, crossed over the Nile and conquered the indigenous North Africans, founding many tribes of Berbers and naming Africa. Interesting enough, the tribe Abida inhabits the South Arabian area and directly across from Yemen in the Horn of Africa. The Cushitic tribe called Afar dwells in Djibouti and Eritrea. Avalis or Havila was known as the country of the troglodytes and is now known as Zaila. It is located in modern Somalia. More will be said about these traditions and the troglodytes and the Baja later, the Berbers of the Romans. The word Berber is utilized to describe present day inhabitants of North Africa who speak pre Islamic North African dialect. They represent a highly amalgamated peoples, varying in appearance and morphology. Modern day Berbers, however, modified by racial intermixture, still speak a language related to other indigenous dialects of northern and eastern Africa. Their language has been suggested to have some Semitic elements and Indo European words as well. But while many of the modern day tribes denoted by scholars as Berbers have a strong Caucasoid element, biologically speaking, especially those in northern regions of North Africa, the ancient Berbers were evidently more African than they were European, and as such were often spoken as Ethiopians. Words like Hemite and brown or Glassal Mediterranean have been employed by anthropologists to describe both the indigenous and Ethiopia, and have been as the anthropologists to describe both the indigenous, indigenes, indigens,
Yeah, indigenous.
indigens of Ethiopia, as well as the very hybrid populations of modern day North Africa. Such terms, besides tending to hide the fact that modern Berber speakers are a product of amalgamation, mostly recent, also believe the fact that the original Berber and Arab populations in North Africa were biologically and ethnically affiliated with modern day peoples of the South Egypt, especially those who now speak languages of the Ethiopic and Cushitic groupings. The name Mori has as the name Mori, as has been said, was first used for one of the several dozen black tribes that occupied North Africa even before the Christian era. The tribe itself included several clans, including Morai Mazaziks, Morai Boreres, Morai Bigoda, and Morai Gentiani. It is one of these clans, the Boreres and Bavaras, whose names was frequently amended to Barbares or Berbers. So that's where they get Barbary from in the ancient Roman text. So Claudian, a prominent Roman of the 4th century AD, complained about Gildo, the Moorish ruler in Algeria, claiming that in handing over Roman matrons of Sidon to his fellow Moorish countrymen, he made hideous Ethiopian hybrids, affrighting the cradles of Roman provinces of North Africa. One of the culprits he names in this regard are the Berbers. Gildo himself was one of the Berbers. The use of the term Berber in this paper will thus be for the original indigenes of North Africa known simultaneously as Moors and Ethiopians, who were the wandering Libyans, spoke of by Herodotus, and the descendants of Danos and the Black Dananites of other early Greek writers. On the origins of the term Berber, there are many instances in ancient classical literature where names of foreign tribes were caricatured into punning words intelligible to Greek audiences. The word Berber seems to be one of these. The term has often been associated to mean barbarian, but as G. Camps points out, the word barbarous or Berber in manuscripts was different from the normal plural meaning barbarian, which was Barbary. This is one of the main reasons for considering the word Berber indigenous to the Africans themselves. G. Camps and others have also mentioned that the term Berber appears sporadically in the toponyms of the Hamitic speakers. The linguistic grouping formerly called Hamitic by scholars included various dialects of the Cushitic and Omotic branches in Eastern Africa besides the Berber and Chadic dialects in ancient Egyptian. The term Eritrean and Afro-Asiatic is now utilized for these and the related Semitic languages. If, as is now presumed, this linguistic grouping had its beginnings in the Eastern Sudan, then we can assume that the root bar, bur, or bur signified what it does now among such peoples as the Berbers and Cushites in Africa, which is the phallus, young man or warrior or a warrior. In modern Cushitic or Tamashik, oh, they hate me. Tamashik. I gotta just stop it. Pick it back up. Yeah, I'm just gonna end it.